She thought it was just another flight, a routine journey, another shift, another passenger. But when Vanessa, a seasoned flight attendant, refuses to serve a man in first class, she has no idea who he really is. Until their eyes meet, her pulse stops. He isn't just any passenger. He's her ex-husband, the man who vanished 5 years ago without a word. What happens next will leave everyone on board speechless. If you love stories filled with shocking twists and second chances, hit subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from. The flight from New York to Paris was expected to be smooth, an uneventful journey across the Atlantic. At the front of the cabin, Vanessa Carter, a poised and professional flight attendant, adjusted the cuffs of her neatly pressed uniform. She had been in the airline industry for almost a decade and had mastered the art of keeping her composure. No matter how demanding the passengers were, no matter how entitled some acted, she had learned to smile through it all. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for this flight. As she moved down the aisle taking drink orders, her eyes flickered over the next passenger. Seat 2A. A man sat there, his tall frame relaxed, one arm resting on the window side armrest. Dark hair, strong jawline, a hint of 5 o'clock shadow. Something about him sent a chill through her. Then he turned his head. And Vanessa's heart stopped. It was Ethan Blake, her ex-husband, the man who had walked out of her life 5 years ago. Her fingers tightened around the notepad in her hand. The air suddenly felt too thin, too tight. He hadn't seen her yet. Or maybe he had, and just didn't care. Vanessa inhaled sharply, pulling herself together. This was just another passenger, another flight, another service to complete. But when she finally reached him, ready to take his order, he looked up, and their eyes locked. For a split second, she saw something flicker in his expression. Shock, recognition, something deeper. But then his lips curled into a smirk. Vanessa. His voice was smooth, laced with amusement. Long time no see. Her stomach clenched, but she refused to let it show. I'll be serving other passengers, she said curtly, stepping past him before he could say another word. But as she turned away, she could feel it, his eyes still on her, watching. This flight had just become a lot longer than she had planned. Vanessa's heart pounded as she stepped behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin. Her grip on the service tray was tight, her knuckles white. She had faced difficult passengers, even celebrities with egos the size of the plane itself, but nothing compared to the man sitting in seat 2A, Ethan Blake, her ex-husband, the man she had once loved fiercely, and the man who had shattered her heart 5 years ago. Why was he here? Why now? She exhaled sharply, pressing her hands against the cool metal of the galley counter. This was just another passenger, she reminded herself. She could handle this. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Vanessa, her colleague Grace, a fellow flight attendant, stood beside her with a puzzled expression. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Vanessa forced a tight smile. I'm fine. Just a long day. Grace didn't look convinced, but didn't press further. You skipped seat 2A, Grace pointed out, glancing at the service tablet. The guy in first class, dark hair, blue eyes, he hasn't ordered yet. Vanessa's stomach twisted. Oh, he had ordered once. He had ordered her heart and left it broken. I'll handle him later, she said quickly. Can you take care of it? Grace shrugged. Sure. But before Vanessa could breathe a sigh of relief, a voice called from the first-class cabin. Excuse me? Flight attendant? His voice. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. She turned, composed but cold, and stepped back into the cabin. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. You forgot to take my order, he said smoothly. Or was that on purpose? Her jaw tightened. Would you like something to drink? He studied her, as if trying to read between the lines of her professional tone. Whiskey. Neat. Vanessa nodded stiffly and turned away. But before she could take a step, his voice stopped her. How have you been, Vanessa? She froze. She shouldn't answer. She should walk away. But before she could stop herself, she turned just slightly and met his gaze. I'm fine, she said, her voice cool. And I'd appreciate it if you addressed me as Miss Carter during the flight. Something flickered across his face, something she couldn't quite place. But before he could say anything else, she walked away, leaving him in silence. This flight was only 6 hours long, but right now it felt like eternity. Vanessa moved through the cabin with practiced ease, serving drinks, answering passenger requests, doing everything she could to ignore the man sitting in 2A. But no matter how much she tried to focus, she could feel him watching her. It was the same feeling she used to have years ago, when she would catch Ethan staring at her across the kitchen table in their old apartment. The way his gaze would linger, like she was the only person in the world that mattered. But that was a long time ago, and she had no interest in revisiting memories that no longer belonged to her. Yet, Ethan wasn't making it easy. As she passed by his seat again, she felt it, the slight shift of his body, his fingers grazing the edge of his glass, the way his eyes never left her. Then, just as she was about to turn away, he spoke. "Vanessa, we need to talk." Her grip tightened on the tray. "Number not here, not now." "There's nothing to talk about," she replied, keeping her voice even, professional. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Blake." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You can pretend all you want, but I know you, Vanessa. You're not fine." Her stomach twisted. He had lost the right to know her a long time ago. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her cold. "I never wanted to leave." For a moment, the noise of the plane faded into the background. The hum of the engines, the murmurs of passengers, none of it mattered, because those words should have meant something. But they didn't, because he had left. Vanessa forced herself to breathe, to remind herself that this was the past. She wasn't the same woman who had waited for a man who never came home. She turned back to him, eyes sharp, voice steady, but cold. "And yet you did." Ethan's jaw tightened. There was so much unsaid between them, but this wasn't the time, and it certainly wasn't the place. Before he could say another word, a chime sounded overhead, and the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Vanessa took it as a sign to walk away, and this time she did. But the storm between them was just beginning. The plane lurched as turbulence rocked the cabin, sending a brief ripple of unease through the passengers. Overhead compartments rattled slightly, and a few startled gasps filled the air. Vanessa instinctively gripped the seat beside her to steady herself, her heartbeat quickening, not from the turbulence outside, but from the storm brewing inside her. She had spent the last hour avoiding Ethan Blake. But somehow, no matter where she turned, he was still there. She moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, reassuring passengers with a calm smile, her professional mask firmly in place. But as she neared seat 2A, she hesitated. Ethan sat there, unaffected by the turbulence, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, his whiskey glass still half full, but his eyes, those familiar piercing blue eyes, were locked on her. It was infuriating how calm he looked, while her entire world had tilted off balance. Vanessa knew she should walk past him, ignore him, treat him like any other passenger. But then, the plane jolted violently. A sharp dip in altitude sent her stumbling, straight toward him. Before she could catch herself, a strong hand gripped her wrist, firm, steady, holding her just like he used to. For a brief moment, the past crashed into the present. 5 years ago, their apartment. A summer storm raging outside as Ethan pulled her close, whispering that he would always catch her, that no matter what happened, he wouldn't let her fall. But he had. Vanessa jerked her arm back as if burned, stepping away. Her breath came quicker, her pulse hammering in her ears. "You okay?" Ethan's voice was low, but there was something in it, something dangerously close to concern. She forced herself to straighten, to breathe, to steel herself. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice cool, distant. "Not anymore." Something flickered across Ethan's face, something unreadable. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the turbulence eased. The plane leveled out, the tension in the air slowly dissipating. But inside Vanessa, the turbulence had just begun. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Ethan staring after her. But deep down, she knew. This conversation wasn't over. Not yet. The turbulence had settled, but inside Vanessa, the storm still raged. She spent the next hour avoiding seat 2A, forcing herself to focus on her duties, refilling drinks, answering passenger requests, and pretending that Ethan Blake's presence meant nothing. but she could feel it. His eyes. Watching. Waiting. And when the first-class cabin quieted for the overnight portion of the flight, she knew she couldn't avoid him any longer. Vanessa sighed, bracing herself before walking over to his seat. Ethan looked up as if he had been expecting her. "We're not doing this," she said firmly, arms crossed over her chest. "This flight ends in 3 hours, and after that, we go back to being strangers." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "We were never strangers, Vanessa. That's the problem." Her jaw clenched. Number. He didn't get to act like this, like he had been the one left behind. "You walked away," she said, voice barely above a whisper, but filled with years of hurt. "You left without a word, without an explanation. You disappeared, Ethan, and now you want to sit here and act like that never happened?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "I didn't leave you." Vanessa let out a short, bitter laugh. "Then where the hell did you go?" Silence. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was being investigated," he said quietly. "By the FBI." The air shifted. Vanessa froze. Her brain struggled to make sense of the words. "What?" she breathed. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low, controlled. "I was working on a case, Vanessa, a classified one. I was forced to disappear. I couldn't contact anyone, not even you. And by the time it was over, by the time I could have come back, I thought it was too late." She stared at him. 5 years. 5 years of believing he had walked away from her, when in reality he had been taken away. Her fingers curled into fists, her emotions warring between anger, relief, and something more dangerous. "Hope, you should have told me," she whispered. "I couldn't," he said, "and I hated myself every day for it." Vanessa looked away, blinking rapidly. She had spent years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that he was gone, that she didn't need closure. And now, here it was, raw, unexpected, and threatening to break everything she had held together. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for landing. Ethan's voice softened. "I never stopped thinking about you, Vanessa." She swallowed hard, refusing to let her emotions win. "This changes nothing," she said finally. "We're still landing in Paris. And after that, we still go back to our lives." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want." Vanessa wanted to believe it was, but as she turned and walked away, her heart hammered against her ribs, because deep down she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Would you give him a second chance? Vanessa just got the truth she never expected. But is it too late? Would you forgive Ethan if you were in her place? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories filled with unexpected twists, heartbreak, and second chances, hit like and subscribe for more. The plane touched down in Paris, its wheels skidding softly against the runway. Passengers stirred, stretching, gathering their belongings, excitement buzzing through the cabin. But for Vanessa, the real turbulence hadn't passed. She had spent the last few hours trying to process what Ethan had told her, that he hadn't left by choice, but because of an FBI investigation, that he had been forced into silence, that he had suffered too. But something still felt unfinished. As she made her way toward the galley, she expected Ethan to disappear into the crowd, leaving nothing but a ghost of the past behind. Instead, he was waiting for her by the exit. Passengers passed between them, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her. Her breath hitched. This wasn't over. As the last passenger stepped off, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded document. "I wasn't entirely honest," he said, voice low. "The case I was involved in, it's not over." Vanessa's pulse quickened. She glanced at the paper. It was an official FBI document. His name. A classified case. And something that made her stomach drop. Her name. Vanessa snatched it from his hands, her fingers tightening as she read. Her name was linked to the case. Her heart pounded. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The case I was working on? It wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about someone using airline personnel to smuggle information." She froze. "You think I—" "No," Ethan said quickly. I don't think you're involved, but Vanessa, you were being watched. They used your name. Your employee credentials were stolen, linked to the smuggling ring without you even knowing. Vanessa's world tilted. She had spent years thinking Ethan had walked away from her. Now, he was standing in front of her, telling her that their past was tangled in something much bigger than either of them. The reason I disappeared, Ethan continued, was because I was getting too close. They made me go underground. I thought by staying away from you, I could protect you. Vanessa's throat tightened. All the lost years, the heartbreak. It had all been built on a truth she had never known. And now, it was all crashing down. A heavy silence filled the air between them. For the first time, she saw it all in his eyes. The regret, the longing, the pain. He had never stopped caring, never stopped protecting her. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she held them back. "So what happens now?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. Ethan stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the familiarity of him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw and unguarded. "But I know one thing, Vanessa. I'm done running. I lost you once. I won't lose you again." Something inside her broke and healed at the same time. For years, she had built walls around herself. She had tried to forget him, convinced herself that she had moved on. But now, she didn't want to fight it anymore. She didn't want to fight him anymore. Before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the space between them and grabbed him by the collar, pulling him down into a kiss. Not a soft, hesitant kiss, but one filled with everything they had lost. The missed years, the nights spent apart, the longing neither of them had dared to voice. Ethan groaned against her lips, his hands sliding around her waist, gripping her like he was afraid she'd disappear. But this time, neither of them were going anywhere. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Ethan smirked, his forehead resting against hers. "So," he murmured, "still want me to call you Miss Carter?" Vanessa laughed, a genuine heart-melting laugh. "Shut up and kiss me again." He did, and this time there were no more secrets, no more running, just the two of them, and a future waiting to be written.